Well, thanks very much, Mark. To Brendan, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning and to convey some of the thoughts and the priorities of the coalition at this stage of the electoral cycle. Could I just congratulate the IPA to start with for the role they play. It's been an enormous help to me in getting on top of lots of issues. I think the initiatives they take, like we've got here this morning, an excellent program I think today, and the energy of the organisation. It's something that has really impressed me, and the practical focus of the organisation. So it's a great initiative, the formation of it, and I think already bearing a lot of fruit and a lot of influence on both sides of the political aisle. Today gives me an opportunity to give you an indication of where our thinking is at and the priorities that we've got. And I'd like to do that, in shaping our policies over the coming months. I'd like to give you a sense of that by touching on some history and also reflecting on current developments in the infrastructure area. As Mark said, I've got responsibility for infrastructure, but also for my sins, I've got responsibility for climate change policy, which has been a little bit all-consuming. But after nearly 12 months, I've formed a very strong view that climate change is best tackled from a position of economic strength. Only companies with strong balance sheets and a competitive edge will be able to fund the innovative technology necessary to meet even the most modest of abatement targets. This is where Australia can show leadership, through the strength of the private sector in what they can do in an innovative way. It's got lots of parallels, I think, with infrastructure. This need to work from a position of economic strength is equally true of other key challenges we face as a community, including maintaining and growing Australia's infrastructure. It explains why total infrastructure spending in Australia in constant 2007 dollars rose from $21 billion in 1996 to $56 billion in 2007. In other words, an increase from nearly 3% of GDP, the spending on infrastructure in 1996, to 5.4% of GDP in 2007. Much of it through the capacity given to the private sector to exploit that infrastructure spending. And I was involved for several years in business with a lot of the big resource companies, and I'm familiar with a lot of the big projects that took place in the last 10 years around this country. And a lot of it was driven off the back of economic strength and reforms and confidence about the direction of the economy and the management of the economy. Despite the endless denigration and misrepresentation from our political opponents, that level of infrastructure spend is a significant and massive growth in infrastructure as a proportion of GDP over 11 and a half years. And it didn't come about by borrowing and spending. We had to start by fixing Australia's financial infrastructure that we took over in 1996. We paid off $96 billion of government debt. This government, today's government, would have been confronted with an extra $8.5 billion in interest payments each year solely from that debt if the former government had not paid it off, $8.5 billion a year. Paying off that debt and avoiding those interest payments meant close to $100 billion extra was available over those years to spend on infrastructure, on services and on lower taxes to create jobs for Australians, and we saw nearly $2 billion of those created over that time. Fixing Australia's financial infrastructure meant turning around a culture of running massive deficits under the previous Labor administration and replacing it with a culture of running budget surpluses. The coalition fixed up other financial infrastructure. We created an independent reserve bank and introduced rules to govern our financial sector through APRA and ASIC. Those rules are now the envy of the others in the Western world and go a long way to explaining Australia's resilience in the face of the global financial crisis, though you wouldn't know it reading the Prime Minister's recent 6,000-word indulgence. We introduced major reform of the indirect tax system, giving states a huge growth tax to fund vital infrastructure. Sadly, Many incompetent state Labor governments have wasted that legacy. And we made major reforms to superannuation, again, which fed into funds available for infrastructure and other areas. Again, over 11.5 years in government, our sadly depleted defence infrastructure faced a major overhaul, with an annual growth of 3% throughout that period, involving an increase of 47% over 12 years, from $10 billion in 1996 to $22 billion in 2007. Our workforce infrastructure was brought into the 21st century. On the wharves, we had the epic battle to modernise the Australian waterfront. The result has been a 60% improvement in productivity, with average crane rates increasing from 17 movements per hour to world's best practice of 27 or 28 movements per hour. In the workplace, we faced political opposition at every turn, yet introduced major flexibility and abolished the job-destroying unfair dismissal laws for small business. All this resulted in the lowest unemployment rate in 33 years, a youth participation rate ranked second among OECD countries, and a real increase in wages of nearly 22%. In the building and construction industries, the establishment of the ABCC has had a profound impact. Working days lost per 1,000 employees due to industrial action plummeted from 37.4 in late 2005 to just 1.7 in mid-2007. Productivity increased markedly, with projects being delivered on time and within budget, resulting in a staggering 1.5% boost to Australia's GDP, or over $5 billion in dollar terms each year. $5 billion, on top of the $8.5 billion lower interest rates as a consequence of removing debt. This is a far cry from the pre-ABCC days of unbridled union power, when union bosses directed construction schedules and threatening and intimidatory behaviour was commonplace. No government in its right mind would wind back such a major reform, and I can assure you that the Coalition will continue to oppose any attempt by the Rudd government to effectively abolish or water down the activities of the ABCC. These reforms mean that Australia faces the difficulties now and ahead from a position of strength. The reforms did inject a large measure of flexibility into our economy, paid off all federal government debt of $96 billion inherited in 1996, created a $60 billion future fund, created $38 billion for AusLink 1 and 2, created multi-billion-dollar health and education funds, provided all the funds for this government's Building Australia Fund, and created a $10 billion water infrastructure fund. All of that off the back of real reform. I mention this to underscore the importance of real productivity-related reform if we are to afford and attract strong infrastructure spending in the years ahead. Building mountains of government debt is not a sustainable long-term plan. Against this background, you have to ask the question, if the Reserve Bank is flagging the possibility of a housing price bubble emerging in the midst of the biggest financial crisis in 80 years, that maybe the government has overreached with its debt funding spending binge in some areas. What is even more concerning is that with the growth of government debt to $315 billion, a mere $8.5 billion has been earmarked over the next few years for vital economic productivity-producing infrastructure. Tens of billions spent on other things. Furthermore, with this level of debt hanging over future generations, the priority should be to spend every one of these dollars as wisely and as effectively as possible. To this end, the evaluation and ranking of infrastructure proposals must be part of a truly objective and transparent process. Investors and the community need to have an understanding of why projects are chosen, what is the expected contribution to productivity, the relative benefits that would flow from competing projects, and the impact on economic growth. This level of transparency was promised repeatedly in the lead-up to the last election by the Labor Party.